Hey, what's up YouTube? This is Cerberus here, or Dark, whichever you're going to call me. I'm fine with either one. We're going to talk about the board settings and board programming on the Fusion Elite by Dangerous Power. Now, we're not going to go into the last video until after this one. This is to kind of help simplify, especially since you watched the last video. You might have been going through your marker and wondering what some settings were. I'll actually read off the manual to you, and I'll actually explain which setting you're in, and then what entails, what does that setting do for your marker, because if you don't know it, you're not going to be able to do the last video that I'm going to play for you, or record, sorry. Anyways, so one thing I will address, when you're putting back in your screws into your marker for your screw grips, make sure to do it just like this. You want to make sure they're snug. Don't use the long arm, use the short arm. And when it's like that, just give it a little bit of a budge, because it's soft rubber. It'll generally hold itself in place. You don't want to be stripping screws inside your grip. That would be bad. Anyways, so we've got our battery inside our Fusion Elite. Turn it on. See, it comes on. And you're going to have battery symbol in the corner, your profile in the left-hand corner. Then you're going to have semi, what mode you're in, balls per second, the eyes, and then if it's tournament locked or not, it'll be a little lock symbol. Now let me turn it off and I'll explain it to you. Alright, on the back, your eyes off button is going to be a plus value. The power off button, which is your down one, will be a low value. What that means is when you're looking at the board and we're going through these settings, they'll have a name, and then on the very right hand side is going to be a number. Every time you hit one of these two buttons, you're either going to increase the value or decrease the value of that number. Now, how you'll scroll through that options is going to be your trigger. Every time you hit the trigger, the little arrow on the left hand side is going to go down. If you, when you're going through and you're actually your flow chart, that's, by the way, I'll show you something on your instructions. If you're looking for a specific setting to adjust, it's going to be in your instructions. Here's the flow chart. Looks like a tree. You're going to start off here, and then every setting you go into and activate, you'll activate by holding your trigger on it, and it'll put you into that setting. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and get into the board itself, but one thing I will address is up in the two left-hand corners, left-hand and right-hand corner, sorry. The left-hand corner is going to have an arrow that points this way, and then on the right side you're going to get an X mark. The X marks, when you hold your trigger on it, when it appears, it brings you all the way back to this menu, your live fire menu. And you actually can go play, so as soon as you're done with your settings, you can actually go to the X, hit it, lock it, and it'll actually send you back out to your firing settings. The other one, the back arrow, like let's say you are here, you're in the statistics. When you hit that back arrow button, it'll send you all the way back to the beginning. It's basically like a backspace. So just keep that in mind when you're going through your settings. Now, when you're going through, you got your program menu. When you hit it, it goes through into your program menu at the top, and then your statistics will send you to this section, which is your peak, your total pulls on your marker, your total shots ever fired in the marker. The bottom one would be your trigger trainer. So just keep that in mind. Where the program menu is what we're going into, and we're going to go into program menu. We're going to go into program menu, program set. When we go through it, we're going to go through marker set 1, marker set 2, and firing modes. We're not worried about the profile menu or the tour mode menu, because when you get into those are generally like, you can actually set tournament, hot start, PSP Pro, profile menu. You can set up all of those through your profile menu, and then your tour menu is going to be your different firing modes. These are explaining the firing modes down here. We're not worried about that. We're worried about setting the marker, because we're trying to fine tune it to the last video we're going to do. Now, on your marker set 1, these options or these settings will appear. One of them is your BPS eyes on, which is how many balls per second you fire with your eyes on. The BPS fine, what that means is, like, if you're shooting 10.2 balls per second, that means every second you're shooting 10.2, and everybody's like, what's the 0.2? Well, the 0.2 is kind of like multiplication. When that 0.2 goes over that point, so like let's say 10, 4, 6, 8, 10, and that 1 goes over, that means every 5 seconds you now get 1 extra ball. So keep that in mind. That's what the fine stands for. The BPS eyes off, this means with your eyes turned off, you'll get this many balls per second. Trigger debounce. Now on the default, by the way, one thing I did like that they did in the instructions, Dangerous Power did, you actually had the values for your default on the inside. So if you're wondering what your default settings are, here they are. They will be in your instructions. What the trigger T-pounce is the lower the value is on the trigger T-pounce, the more erratic your marker will fire. The higher the number is, the more reliable it will fire. And it's in sequence with how you pull a trigger. Mine sits at 10, their default's at 20. Now, I'm not sitting on the back of cans. The last time I played, I was in snakes, so mine will be more erratic. And I'm not really worried about, I'm worried about more or less holding a lane, and I'm more or less trying to keep people down. So keep that thought in mind. That setting will change between person to person. Generally, I find most people sit at 10, 12, 15, 17, or 20. It's just going to make your marker fire a little bit more erratic or a little bit reliable. That's it. Most people, if you want to save air, you can set it up to 20. It's just more or less in sequence with who you are. Once again, if your dwell is too high, that's not going to help you too much if you're trying to save air. Solenoid dwell. Now, we talked about this in the last video. If you didn't watch the last video, your solenoid dwell is going to be how your solenoid is going to be energized. And what that means is how much air and how much power your solenoid is going to use. Now, the higher that value is, the more it's going to use. Be careful with this, because on marker settings number 2, your bolt return, if these two values are conflicting each other, like they're very close, you'll end up with soup, because one is trying to energize the bolt and the other one is trying to return the bolt. You got to be careful with that. Generally on bolt return, I've seen most people sit between 12, 15, and 17. And most people, when it comes to the solenoid dwell, I seem to sit between 9, 10, and 11. Now, I'm not saying those are going to be your ultimate settings, because once again, it differs on the temperature that you have outside, the weather, what paint you're using. Got to be careful with that. Make sure you're following how to tune your solenoid dwell. I guess I'll go ahead and explain it again. Solenoid dwell, how are you going to tune it is like this. You're going to go inside and change it to a 7, 8, or a 9. I probably recommend an 8, probably a 7. And what you're going to do is make sure your OPR is functioning and shooting your marker at 250, 260 volts per second. What's going to end up happening when you shoot, your plus or minus is going to be somewhere around plus or minus 30. That's going to be a little bit creepy. Don't panic. It's fine. What you want to do then is go back in your board and increase the value by 1. So you're going to go from, like, if you say you're 7, you're going to go to 8, and you're going to notice that number is going to decrease between the plus or minus. You might get it like at 20. Next time you might get it like 10. You want to get it as low as you can possible until it stops, like plus or minus 6, and it's just dead stopped. You can go up 1 more past that. That's fine. If you just leave it there and use your LPR to energize the RAM, use more kinetic energy, that's fine too. Be really careful with that, because your bolt return is going to affect how the bolt returns back, and it can end up being soup, because the dwells sending so much energy at one time, and then your bolt return is hitting the ball faster than the solenoid can actuate. Be careful with that. Make sure they're not in confliction. That's the reason why a lot of people, like, if you'll notice, the manual says the dwell, leave it at like 10. Yeah, right here it says it actually has the dwell at 10. Now, one thing that I did notice that it says on the instructions, when you go up, blah, blah, blah. Let's go all the way over here. Just to give you an example of, like I said earlier, I've seen people sit 9, 8, 9, 10, 11. See if you'll notice right here, solenoid dwell. Where's the optimal? Let's head it right here. Here you go. It says optimal dwell setting for the Elite should be set to 11. Refer to the board settings adjustment segment for adjusting dwell settings. ABS dwell is recommended when experiencing first shot drop-off. Now, this is the ABS dwell. I've already passed the solenoid. I sure did. Sorry. Well, we're done with the solenoid anyways. We already know we generally sit about 10. Now, the ABS dwell is your anti-bolt stick dwell. And what that is going to be like first shot drop-off. What that means is a lot of spool valves, and a lot of other markers, for instance, the shockers, used to have first shot drop-off real bad. And it was because, I'm not saying user error, because some of those markers just had that problem. There was either not enough lube used or too much lube used, and the bolt is trying to work past it. But generally with this poppet, it's not really, that setting's not really going to be adjusted very much. Honestly, it sits at 0 right now. If you'll notice ABS dwell, and even in mine it's 0. I've never had to adjust it because I'm always cleaning my marker, make sure it's well lubed, make sure it's ready to go, make sure there's not too much lube in it. So generally, just keep that in mind when it comes to that setting. We'll go back to it. It says dwell setting may be adjusted, but should be turned in conjunction with bolt return timing in mind so that there is no conflict of setting values. I already did say that. Basically, it's just saying the same thing I said again. Sorry, I'm just making sure to read off the instructions to y'all so that way y'all, if you're having problems understanding, I can help you with it. Alright, so we're going back out. Now we're going back to auto shut off. It sits at 0. If you change that, like you add 1 to it, that marker, if the marker is not being used, in 1 minute it'll shut itself off. Then you have the splash screen is on. There's the splash screen at, so I can explain it. Blah, blah, blah. Blah, 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 blah. This determines that the splash screen display is that marker set up. Mine's on. You can leave it on or off, it doesn't really matter. Because it determines the splash screen is displayed at marker setup. That's all it does. Now, marker settings 2 is going to have your bolt return in it. Now, this is another important setting because this is what we use to get. If you'll notice in the fine-tuning video, the first one and the second one, we adjusted that one. That is a massively important. That's just as important as the dwell. So just make sure to keep that in mind. What the bolt return does is, I'll just read it right off right here. This set point establishes the amount of time in milliseconds after firing a round that the marker waits for the bolt to return to the back position. Remove assuming aftermarket parts are approved to be used. There's no aftermarket parts for the Fusion Elite that I don't know of. This data establishes the amount of time in milliseconds after firing a round, having the marker wait to see the bolt transition back past the eyes. This value may be adjusted to provide proper tuning procedures, which is important. Bolt return. Optimal bolt return setting for the Elite should be set at 15 milliseconds. Once again, I set mine's on 12 right now. I don't recommend really going any lower than that, especially with some dwell settings out there. Once again, big reminder, dwell settings change with the weather, with the heat of the day, with the paint that you use. So make sure if you're adjusting that setting a lot, to go back and change your bolt setting. You don't want them to conflict each other. That would be a bad thing. Bolt return settings can be changes, but should be tuned in conjunction with solenoid dwell timing in mind so that there is not a conflict of setting values. We just read that in the other one. Anyways, I'm just repeating it. You already know it. I've already stressed it enough. So solenoid dwell 9, 10, 11. I see people at bolt return 12, 15, 17. Just keep that in mind. OLED intensity. You can actually increase the brightness of your OLED board. Now, if you're wondering where that says, it actually says OLED internals. When you go through your settings on marker setting number 2, it'll say OLED intense. That is your intensity settings for that. Now, cap firing. This means that you have a cap when you pull your trigger on your ramping or on your semi. So you can only get 10 balls per second or 12 balls per second. Whatever your setting is, that's your cap. With it being off, the marker will keep stacking the shots. So be careful on that, especially if your field recommends that you have to have cap 10. If you have it on 10 and the cap is off, it'll shoot past it. Burst shots, we're not worried about that. That's how many shots you get in your burst mode. Then you have reactive shot, not worried about that. Ramp shot, how many ramp shots you get. Once again, it's always 3. Don't need to mess with that. Ramp rate, this is the trigger pull per second that needs to be achieved before ramping. A lot of these settings past this you're not going to mess with because this is your program set. We're more or less inclined to mess with the marker 1 and marker 2 settings. Those are going to be your big settings when messing with your marker. We're not worried about the profile, not worried about tour mode. I mean, you can do your profile mode if you won't read the instructions, but more or less on the next video that I'm fixing to do, those were the most important, was the dwell, ABS dwell, which generally my ABS dwell is 0. Remember, ABS is anti-bolt stick. Then you have your ABS reset time. That's going to be 10. Since we're not using the ABS dwell, we don't have to worry about that. Just leave it. Do not mess with that setting. Leave the shutoff on 0, especially if you're tuning. You don't want to have it where you're reading through your manual or you're adjusting a setting and have it turn off on you. Just leave it at 0. Then you have your bolt return, which is going to be your first setting in marker number 2. I know I'm going through it again. I just want to make sure that y'all know where everything is at. So make sure that your for the next video, make sure your marker setting is number 1. Number 2 is where you're mainly going to be sitting at. Now, one big piece of advice I'll give you, since this is an OLED board, leaving your battery inside your marker is not a healthy thing for it because it continues to send a charge to the marker. Make sure that you have it rotated over and take the battery out each time you use it. I know it's a butt to put it back in and you might not like it. I'm sorry, but honestly, longevity of a marker, especially one that has an OLED board, make sure you have that always removed, and do use, like I said, the long arm and the short arm, and use the long arm going down when you're taking your screws out. Now that concludes this video. Now we'll give you the last video that you're going to need, and I wanted to make sure to go through it so that way if you're like new and this is your first marker, you understand that these are the important settings I need to mess with. The other ones are not so much. That way, before we get on this next video, because this next video is gonna be tricky, okay? So bear with me. Hopefully I'll explain it to you. So this is Dark. Adios.